Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Gary. We have about 5 minutes for questions and thoughts from the audience. And so I wanted to just leave it up to anybody. If you have any questions, if you can either come up to this microphone or even just simply raise your hand. Over here, Kenyatta.
It's super bright. Yeah, great. So I'm going to blinding.
Hi. My name is Kenyatta. I love both of your talks. They were really good. But I have a question. You talk about creative ways of doing storytelling within the network, but who's actually doing creative networking for their stories? Do you have any examples?
Tell me more of what you mean when you say creative networking.
Because
what do you mean?
Because if the story is that when you're on these networks, it's not so you can actually put together some amazing stories and find interesting ways of expression, but how do you sort of get it out there, right? Mm-hmm. Who's actually doing that in a way where they're actually exploiting the network in a positive manner?
Well, I think sites like Cowbird are new storytelling networks, right? Where you have to, it's more of an invitation-only thing. What I've been noticing is that more creatives are building networks that can be skinned and shared by others. So the new project, the Arab Spring project, how many days in?
18 days in Egypt.
18 days in Egypt. So 18 Days in Egypt is this amazing crowdsourced storytelling platform that is where the filmmaker developed the software backend and the network so that this notion of crowdsourcing the story could then be taken on by other storytellers and other and other networks. And so stuff like that I think is really exciting. The notion of Twitter documentaries happening is a lot of these networks, who's leading the optimization of those networks in a story world are the storytellers. They're not so much the networks, because the developers put their platforms out there and say, here it is, go for it. But Question Bridge is a project now that's Question Bridge black males, but they want Question Bridge Jewish lesbians. They want Question Bridge, whoever. And this is for ethnic groups, cultural groups, identity verticals to come together and say, this is the network we're co-opting. And so I think it's just a matter of exploring backends, because sure, Facebook wants our business, Twitter wants our business, and it's just now that more creative projects, things like 18 Days, things like Question Bridge, it's just the beginning.
Over there, Julie.
Hi, I also want to reiterate this is like a really great talk and really made me think about things. I wanted to ask you about, Gary, you mentioned Reddit. There was something recently with the Woody Harrelson I Am where basically it kind of got derailed. It was an instance where the network and the storyteller turned on each other. I wonder if you could talk about that, or if you are going to network, if you're trying to put your story out there, what happens if, the masses kind of turn on you, or do you just surrender yourself to it, or try to deal with that?
Yeah. So I know a little bit about. I followed that a little bit. I think I read the first sentence of the Woody Harrelson issue, and then I kept reading. I kept going because I knew what was going on. But I think the big problem with that one is that they were trying to engage in a PR campaign based on an old model of having someone plan a bunch of awesome stuff about Woody, and then he would just dive in and smile, and then the masses would mindlessly be happy with that, which is no longer the world that we live in. We live in a world now where there's transparency, where people will go and find out what you truthfully did or didn't say, where you can no longer represent yourself with anything but authenticity. And I think that's where that fell apart. And I think now more than ever, the fact that we live in with all these networks and with the density, you have anyone, if there's, Redditors will go out and seek the truth no matter what, right? And so you have to play it real, and Woody was not playing it real, or his PR person wasn't playing it real. And I think that gets back to the values point, which is the values of Reddit are such where they demand transparency, right? that's baked into the internet, but I think it's also particularly strong on Reddit. And you can't go on and try to play in Reddit space unless you really share those values, unless you really want to play by those values. One of the ways that we think about, one other way to think about networks is almost to think about them as other countries or nations, where the users of these networks are citizens, where those citizens have a set of rules, whether written or unspoken, that are based on their values and beliefs. And so if you want to go and do a campaign on Tumblr or do a campaign on Reddit, you have to learn to understand what are the cultural norms of those places, and what those languages are, and what the vocabularies are of those places. And if you fail to do that, then you're going to look like an idiot, which is what he did.
The thing is, too, cultural norms are probably the hardest thing to change. And once you kind of grab onto those, my big question is if those people, we start to feel a sense of ownership around our networks when they're actually owned by someone else. And so it's very clear Facebook doesn't belong to us, and all these networks are actually wholly owned by someone else. How we manage that is really interesting. People get all up in arms when Facebook changes how things are going, and now everyone has to have a timeline. It's like that content doesn't really belong to you on those specific networks. So it's just interesting how things are going to develop.
I think the one thing I'll add to that is that we talk as if hierarchies and networks are black and white, but there are a continuum that are in between. And you have networks that are very centralized, where there's an immense amount of control, where they dictate what your identity is to you, as opposed to allowing you to express your identity however you so choose. And those manifest themselves in the product decisions, in the design decisions, and how identity is represented, into the governance. It's going to be a really interesting time over the next few years to see how these startups evolve and how their relationship with their end users evolve. Where and we'll see what happens.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your questions, and thank you, Wendy and Gary, and thanks to everybody who's continuing the conversation on Twitter.